I am just going to welcome all of you to Just Talking with Aisha, Adami Maguida, and myself. And this week we are going to start the conversation on death and dying. And I guess I'm just going to start off by letting you know, if for those of you that may or may not know, I did publish or co-author a story called Wrestling with the Urn, which is really about my experience with death and dying. Part of that is being raised by a gerontological nurse. So, we talked about what we wanted done at the end of our lives. And we were all young. Like, I don't think I was over 15. It might even have been younger than that. So we had that, as well as I knew probably 17 people between the ages when I was about 10 years old to when I was about 21 that passed away that I knew in varying levels. But this really helped me to get clear on the whole thing about life. Is death is part of life. And I'm really grateful to have been raised in a home that normalized it, because it is going to be hard. It's hard for any of us, right? When we lose something, even like, let's also be clear. I think probably one of these weeks we're probably going to delve into just the topic of grief, but it's a hard time. It's going to be hard. There's a lot of fallacies around death and dying, but the biggest thing is, I also knew, like in my work with Make-A-Wish, where I would have people come up to me at AGMs when I was the director of wish granting and ask me what was it like to work with kids that were dying? And it's like, no, just because you have a diagnosis does not mean that death is imminent, right? And part of what we did at Make-A-Wish, and part of the thing that makes it so powerful, is that you give the whole family an opportunity to think of anything outside of just this that was taking over their whole life. Especially in the cases, kids that had cancer, you would have to, go through all different treatments. And really the people that work with kids are fabulous. But when I would turn and say, well, we're all dying, we just don't know when. Like from the time we're born, we're a step closer. And the executive director would almost like hip check me out of the way and go, no, most people don't think like you do. And so this is where we come to this week. And that's what this week is all about, is about how our experiences and how we're raised, and really a lot of society influences us in the way that we think and the way we embrace these times. And so, because again, Aisha and myself, we start by just having a general conversation, and then it goes somewhere else. And that's why I love that the universe has put the two of us together. So she's really going to be driving a lot of this next month, and there is going to be 5 weeks. So I'm going to pass to Aisha because she's really the reason why we're doing this. And take it away, Aisha.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Gwenda. And, I have to thank you, Gwen, because when you mentioned, when we were talking about what we wanted to do this year, and you said, how about in February we talk about death and dying, I really just felt like all of a sudden I felt like, because I have this huge fear of dying, and I've had it, for most of my life, I think for as long as I can remember. And I think that, especially, and we can, and maybe we want to also at some point address, the relationship that trauma survivors have with death, because that's a whole other kind of, animal there. But, it brings up a lot for me, because I feel like I've spent a lot of my life kind of turning away from death, like really just avoiding it. Like, I think one thing for me that I would say that I regret is that I had a very strong bond with my maternal grandmother, and she raised me. I think I was about like 1.5 or 2 years old. I lived with her. I was like she spoiled me, she pampered me, I was the apple of her eye. And, you know, and then in her later years, where after the death, untimely death of my maternal, what of my oldest maternal uncle, she basically lost any desire to
Mm,
participate in life, you know, and I watched her become a shell of the person that she used to be. She was a very strong person. She was a very powerful person. She was a doctor, which was unheard of in that time in India and Pakistan. Like, you know, she was just a very powerful person, and she was a very strong person, and she was a great leader. And, you know, and then that same person was the person who would just lie on her bed with her prayer beads, and it felt like she was just waiting
mm,
for to be taken, right?
mm,
And it was really hard to reconcile that, you know. And when she did pass, um I didn't go see her. I just
mm,
really avoided it. I just didn't want to go and see her, you know. And that's always something that stayed with me. I mean, there's the ritual of how to say goodbye and how to have closure. That's a different thing. But and maybe that's another thing to talk about, is what happens when you can't, right? Especially in the COVID times, where many of us separated from people who are passing. Um, you know, so that was, I think, the first time that I was really aware of how much I had turned away from death and how much I didn't want to look at it. So when you provided this opportunity, uh, I realized that, you know, that this was a gift. It was a gift from you. It was a gift from the universe to really be able to open up that space and to be able to have that conversation, you know. And it also brings up a lot of things around culture, how different cultures deal with death, right? So in Pakistan, I remember when we lived there, I lived there for 6 years between the ages of 16 and 22. And when people passed away there, the body would come back to the home, and if it was a man, then the male relatives would bathe the body, and then they would cover it in a single sheet, and they would put it out in a room where people could come and they could say their goodbyes. If it was a female, then the female relatives would do the same thing. And and it was a part of your life. It was a part of everyday life, right? So you saw it, you experienced it. There wasn't any hiding away from it. People were together. There was community. There was, you know, it wasn't like you would be there for a day and then you wouldn't see anybody. There's also in, you know, in Islam, there's different kinds of rituals. So 40 days later, there is a ritual where it's the 40th day, and then, you know, like for example, in some places, I believe that you don't turn on the oven, or you don't turn on the stove. So you rely on people around you to bring food because you don't do any cooking, right? So it's all those things that, you know, it's kind of built into the culture that you have that time to grieve, and that
mhm.
people understand that you're grieving, and there's no expectation of, oh, are you still talking about it, or why aren't you over this yet?
Ugh,
Right. Like, you know, those kinds of things, like that's not a part of it, because people understand that this is what happens when you lose someone, you know. So so it kind of, what so that's part of how I'm thinking about it, is how I've experienced death in the Western culture, because that's me. You know, I'm in two places, you know. That's my interesting that I'm a Libra also, so it's always about the, you know, the split. But it's the South Asian culture, and it's the North American culture that I've grown up in, that really gives me that opportunity to look at it from those two different vantage points, and see how different they are, how much we avoid death, how we try and look away from it, avoid it, do this to live longer, you know, all this stuff. Like there's all that stuff that's happening around us. So I think when my grandmother passed, I at that point I was back into the Western mentality, and just afraid, and not wanting to see her in that state, not wanting to see her passed away, not wanting to be around it, not wanting to think about it. So it's something that I do regret, and it that And this opportunity has given me the impetus to really think about um, looking at it in a different way and being more accepting of it. And I'll just finish off by saying that I'm reading audiobooking Tara Brach's book,
Mm.
Radical Acceptance. And just this morning, there was one thing that she said that really just resonated with me. And she said that in life, fear is lifelong training, and it's training for death, because that is the biggest fear of all, right? And when she said that, I was just like, yeah, I get that. I definitely get that. So all the little fears that we deal with throughout our lives are just training for us to get ready for the big fear that's there.
Wow. Like, again, thank you for sharing. And I think, yeah, that's awesome. I think we've just got the next 4 weeks um, lined out there. Because, you know, that's absolutely everything that you're saying. You know, my mother's side is half Irish, or half one Scottish and German, and the other side was Irish, and my grandmother, my grandfather. And so when it came to my grandfather's passing, which was one of my first formal ones, we weren't allowed to wear black because we weren't mourning. We were celebrating a life. And you know, me and my sisters all wore the matching. I was like grade 6. So I was like 10, 11. And that I wrote about that in my chapter because it was beautiful, because back then, like when a hearse drove down the road, and they were small town, like down near Port Stanley, you know, Union, which was this big in Ontario. When a hearse drove by, the men on the poles would come down and take off their hats. All the cars would pull off at the road, and there was this respect that you could have for somebody, and that's the ritual that's around it. But we definitely now, unfortunately, it was also put upon us that we weren't necessarily allowed to cry, that we had to celebrate. But if you get into it a little deeper, the whole thing with the Irish is that they have the wakes, and in the culture that you're talking about, where it's acceptable to grieve, it's acceptable to be sad. And what happens with the Irish is they'll get drunk and they'll tell stories, right? And they'll tell stories and they'll celebrate. And so when you're crying about somebody, and the number of people that I've talked into giving eulogies, because you know, everybody's like, oh, I don't want to get up there. It's like, okay, this is not about you. This is you get the opportunity to stand up and talk about how you love this person, or a funny story. And I think that's you know, especially during this time, like even COVID, this is the kind of stuff that's also shown the difference between the cultures that, first of all, they have multi-generationals living in one house, but more importantly, it's also the importance that I know that when I'm taking care of me, I'm taking care of my family. And we don't have that in North America. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard for us to understand. But it's like, that was the thing with it. So a little bit of trivia, there's a living room, because that's where you sit when you're living, and then you'd have the sitting room. I took a home funeral course, so I believe it's the sitting room, which is the one that was at the front of the house, and that's where you actually had the body, and people would come in and pay their respects, and then you'd end up going and having that sense of community is so vital. And being allowed to grieve, like, we do not honor grief in any way, shape, or form. And grief is not just when somebody dies. It's when, you know, you've lost a job, or you know, you've had kids and they're moving on to the next point of their life. That means that you're an empty nester now, and it's like, what do I do? I have to talk to my husband, I have to talk to my wife. So it's interesting that even the topic of grief, it's getting more attention these days. But I think I'm very excited because just all the topics that we've just brought up. So this is going to be our next few weeks. I'm going to pass it over again, but just to look at this, we're going to look at trauma, people, and death, because I had probably, I have to say, quite honestly, it was 3 weeks ago during a meditative process that I realized I wasn't going to die, so I could make plans. And I'm 57. But now that explains why I didn't make plans before. So I think trauma and death or dying, or just trauma and death, both of those, because death can be the trauma as well, right? So, and then grief, and then one of the things that I loved about the the Muslim faith is that it's always a pine box. You're not spending 10, 20, $30,000 on an oak casket that's polluting, like, and again, maybe we can get into one of the practicalities. We are going to have our first guest on February 28th, which is a good friend of mine, the person that I can talk about death and dying with openly, but she's a certified death doula and is also a certified grief recovery specialist, as well as a hospice worker. And so she's going to be our guest. So if anybody has any questions along these lines, but it's the kind of things that everybody's really good about. Okay, let's be a vegan because cows eat the grass, but it's like we don't look at the fact, and this is just a little bit, is that where do we put all these boxes in the ground of people that are, how much land is, how much it costs in the city of Toronto. Well, you're going to have people stacked on top of each other at one point, and this is a reality that's maybe, it's also an emotional, and that is also emotional, that it's like, we think there has to be one place for time immemorial for us to go and to be able to pay homage to our loved one, when you can just pick a rock that reminds you of them. And that's what makes a ritual a ritual. So I'm actually excited about how we can take this. And of course, we'll more fine tune it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything that I've just rambled about, and see if there's anything else that that springs to mind as we have this. This is sort of a starting point on both of our thoughts on this subject. So as we go down through the weeks.
Yeah. Before I get to that, I just wanted to very respectfully and with lots of love say that you don't ramble.
Oh.
You're in free flow. You are like free flow of consciousness. And there is such a value in that, right? There's a value in taking pauses, and there's a value in just allowing yourself to speak fully and to allow yourself to express everything that you're feeling. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate and value that about you. Yeah, I do.
Thank you.
You touched on, of course, I love you. You touched on a lot of things. I think that, when you just even the idea of doing this has given me an opportunity to really open up a little bit, and when you just talked about ritual, we recently, the people that I work with at my current job, we had someone who was close to us in terms of a colleague that was, did some work with us and did it quite frequently. She passed away suddenly, and we only found that out on Tuesday, and there was a lot of kind of shock and disbelief because she was living alone. We didn't know if there was anyone who had been with her, which we didn't think there had been. We didn't know if she, what her experience might have been in that moment to realize that, oh my goodness, like this is it. Was it fast? Was it easy? Did she experience any pain? How long was she there before someone realized that he's not that, it was the whole thing of it, was very unnerving, and it really was very upsetting for all of us. And at the end of the week, we had a meeting. Those of us who knew her on the management team, we had a meeting, and it occurred to me before I went to the office. I said, I feel very unsettled by this. This is really kind of sitting with me in this way where I feel like we're never going to get a chance to tell her how much we cared about her and how much we loved her, and how, even with any kind of challenges we had with her, how we still were able to get through that because we had that connection with her, and we knew her heart. You know what I mean? So I took in a candle in my one of my singing bowls, and I had talked to a friend of mine before this as well, just that I told her I wanted to do this, and I said I brought this stuff here.
Ooh,
Oh, sorry, you're back there.
a
Sorry about
lovely
that.
picture, but yes.
Sorry. Uh, I took it in and I said, listen, if it's okay with you guys, I'd like to just take a minute. And if we could, if anyone feels comfortable sharing, maybe just share an experience with her or a memory of her, and then thank her. And let's just have a moment to do that.
Mm.
And so one of my colleagues who, um, she doesn't like all this emotional, mushy, cushy stuff. And she said, well, I'm only going to talk for like a couple of minutes and that'll be it. And we're like, okay, well, go ahead. Why don't you start? Right. So I lit the candle, and then she talked for 20 minutes.
Mhm.
And it's just that opportunity that she was able to really talk about the memories that she had with her, and really, like, I almost feel like for the first time she articulated what kind of connection she had with her, because she had known her the longest and she had the strongest bond with her of all of us, right? And so everybody else went around the room, and we did that. And then at the end, we said thank you. We said, wherever you are, I hope you're in peace. Hope it was an easy death for you. I hope that you went in your sleep. I hope you went
Mm.
easily. And we, rang the bell, and it was just very comforting to have that space to be able to talk about her, to send her love, to send her good wishes, and to be able to just have a moment of closure that we would not have otherwise gotten. Because in this COVID environment, also, we've had this experience, I've had this experience, and others have, of knowing people that have passed away, where you can't go, you can't be with your community, you can't be with your people, you don't have that opportunity to really connect, and to be able to share those memories with people, and to be able to have your final goodbye with the person that was in your life. And so this talking about this and creating the space to have this conversation allowed me to really tap into that desire for ritual, and desire for connection around our colleagues passing, which ultimately ended up being something that was comforting and valuable for everybody in the room. So, I think there's a lot to be said for um, giving that space to grieve, allowing for that understanding that somebody is no longer on the same physical plane as us, but to know that perhaps they're on a non-physical plane where they can still hear us, maybe, right? Where we can still reach out to them and we can still stay connected to them in some way. So, I think that's super important. And I think that more of us, we want to be talking about that, and to normalize what is not just abnormalized, but avoided and shunned and ignored in our day to day, especially in this kind of, in the milieu that we live in the Western milieu that we live in. So yeah, a lot of that really, what you said really resonated with me, and that's what came up just thinking about the idea of ritual and normalization, and having a place for grief, and having a place for connection and for community, because that's also very, very important. And the other thing that you talked about how people see themselves resting after they're on, like, that's, it's a scary thing to think about, because you are, I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. Like, many of us have heard that term,
Mhm.
but when you actually think about, how am I going to pass away? What's going to happen to my body? You still have an attachment to your body. You don't want to
Mhm.
think that you're going to be, you know, four people in a, in a grave, because there's something upsetting about that, right? To not have your own space, not to have your own, so these are a lot of interesting things to think about in this time of COVID, in this time of um, like trying to save the earth, trying to do the right thing by the planet, so I think that those are really interesting things that you've raised. And maybe one of those weeks we could talk about exactly what you just said around home funerals, talk about that, talk about more organic, more earth-friendly ways of passing on.
Well, and I think that's exactly it, is that there's, because, it's like any topic that's taboo. The problem with not talking about it is that stuff festers in the corners, right? And in our family, across the board, all of us have known what everybody wants. From I tell you, no word of a lie, it was probably after my grandfather passed away, that we all knew by that time. Both my parents, they wanted to be cremated, and that's what we do. So that's what I want to do, and I know where I want my ashes released. But before this is how I see, because most people are the first place to start is grief, and how that shows up in different ways, and maybe how we can embrace that. We'll do that next week, and then because even in the topic of trauma and death, there's also things like, one of the things that I've been trying to point out through this whole craziness is, you've got a medical community who are, unfortunately, death is the enemy.
Yeah.
Death is not part of life in the medical community.
Yeah.
And that's because their role, the way they look at it, is that they're supposed to fix stuff. They're supposed to find solutions. So even the fact of all our medical community who are sitting and watching people die and they can't do anything. If you're in palliative care, you're trained for that. And trust me, I was with my mother right until like literally an hour before she literally left us, and we were laughing. It was crazy. It was so perfect. I was with my dad until his final breath. But it's my stepfather was, so even talking about, so maybe what we'll start with is, next week we'll do grief, and then maybe we'll do and in grief we'll talk about the trauma associated with grief, which could mean either you already have trauma, which is triggered by that, and then after that we can get into the business of death and dying, because that's a whole other thing. Is when you have like, my father didn't have a will, and it doesn't matter who you are, you should have a will, because the will is not just if you have things, but the amount of people out there. My dad had 44 line items. I had to talk to people 44 different places, and whether or not I had to talk to 2 or 3 people going da da da, that takes an emotional toll. And we may not want to talk about this stuff, but preparing for a good death can also be, let's say, preparing for a good death. And then that can also get into some of the options that people may not be aware of, that you can indeed prepare your loved one at home and have people come in and have it be a magical experience. And then part of that is MAID, which is medical assistance in death, or an EDITH, which is an expected death in the home, and how to prepare for those kinds of things. And also how you can support, especially with MAID right now. If you have thoughts about it, we need you to get those thoughts, contact and if you have any questions on that, feel free, drop a line, let us know. But it's like, I think, again, we have to be able to look at all aspects of life, which includes death. And I just think that it would be really great if we could dignify the ending of death more so for the future. And that's why I'm really happy that we're even having this conversation. So we definitely know that we're going to start next week with grief, or we're going to continue next week with grief. And we'll probably get more of a structure. But again, as always, Aisha, I just love, because we just talk and it goes and it flows. And do you have any closing words or things that you want to leave off on?
Yeah, thank you, love. Me too. I just love how we're able to just talk about all this stuff in in a way that is accessible for people. I think that's really important because we do talk about things that a lot of other people aren't talking about, you know. Um, and I think one thing that's come up for me as you're talking is around the desensitization of death, how especially in the culture we live in, we see a lot of death, and we're very matter of fact about it. You know, we see people dying in other countries. We see people dying in our own communities. We see kids getting shot. We see people dying in car wrecks and in gang wars and things like that. I mean, not gang wars as such in Toronto, thank heavens, but but we still see all this stuff that's happening. And to what degree does the to what degree does media representation of death affect our ability to access our feelings and to really process death? Because I think there's kind of a wall there. I mean, I feel that. I feel like there's kind of a wall there because I'm so used to seeing all this stuff around death, but I don't seem to have any kind of emotional connection to it. And why is that disconnect there? And what can I do about that? How can I make it more accessible? So I like this idea that we are actually, you know, making these things accessible. And if anyone out there has not, I have started watching Surviving Death on Netflix, and I'm 3 episodes in, and it's really very thought provoking. It gives a lot of interesting things to think about in terms of right now, the first 3 episodes, the first one is about near death experience and how that changes people. And the 2 are about mediumship. So, and then there's more. So, it's not just about death. It's actually about, it's also very metaphysical and very philosophical to kind of just explore what do you think about it, and how it affects your life, to the way that you view death. How does that impact how you live?
Yeah. Absolutely. That's why, I mean, people may think I'm a little crazy, but that's why I always tell you I love you. That's why anything that's blocking me from having an open heart, that's what I'm constantly working on. Because even if I see you in a bus stop for 5 minutes, that could be the only time. One of the things, and you would know this, like even leaving India, Pakistan, leaving places where you may not see those people again in physical representation for the rest of your life, right? Like my relatives in Australia, I remember the first time leaving, it's like I just met my relatives and I may never see them again. And just being fully aware at that moment and taking in the shape of their face and telling them how much I appreciated they're offering me places to stay and showing me around. It makes you more fully, or me, I'm just fully present in right now, because we don't know what's coming tomorrow. Now, it's funny how my thing, it was focused on we don't know what's coming tomorrow, it's got to be bad. But again, trauma is an interesting beast. So here we go. We are at just over half an hour, but I just am so grateful and so thankful for this journey together. And next week, we are going to be talking about grief. And again, if you have anything that you want to talk on or stories you want to share, please let us know. So next week's grief, and we'll let you know exactly what the week after is as we move along. So thank you, my darling. It is always a pleasure.
Always, always. Thank you. I'm so grateful for you and for
Okay.
this. Thank you. All right. Bye, everybody.
See you all next week. Have a great week.
Love you.